Yeah, I guess I'll dive right into it. I'm Hunter, one of the co-founders of Orda. We're building really Orda to provide that purpose-built intent network to unify stables, crypto, and fiat into that one developer, one user experience. Let me just see real quick. I'm still not able to see the PowerPoint. Awesome. So we have it here. Yeah, so as Chris mentioned, our goal is really to provide that experience of integrate once, clear anywhere. And in order to do so, we create this network of what you hear typically as intents and solvers, and we bring them together to surface spreads and have them competed on essentially. So the big problem space that we see is legacy models, especially in the money movement chain, have relied on what we refer to as this pricing ladder. And what it basically distills down to is who has access to what and when. So when we look at an example like corridor flow between Brazil and the US, we can really distill it down into the market segments of interbank, institutional, corporate treasury, processor, retail, and SME. When you dive into all these different market segments, you start to see a lot of parallels in today's blockchain world as well. When you replace, let's say, processor with retail wallet. So if you go and you use any sort of user-friendly type of application or wallet, you typically pay a bit of a markup for that experience. So what Orda's plan is, how do we actually create a world where this ladder's collapsed into one where everyone can get access to these interbank spreads, get access to those T0 settlement profiles. And in order to do that, what we do is we provide that one tier access, right? So in order to actually do this, you have to coordinate among several different stakeholders. What we really distill them down into is developers, end users, solvers, and issuers. And you can see here, developers, they get that zero fee experience where their margins are no longer compressed. They don't have to pay subscription fees. They don't need to have monthly minimums. And most importantly, they're not getting exposed to these predatory hidden spreads anymore. For their end users, they get that one UX. No more worrying about which chain is better or which asset do I need to actually store on which network because this stable chain just came out, or this new L2 came out, or this EVM competitor came out. What they should get is really just the best unified experience possible. So when we look at really that front facing lens and who integrates with Orda, we got to look at also how do we actually make this possible? And it all really distills down to that approach of users, developers, they shouldn't be FX traders. They shouldn't be worrying about how to specify their execution path to simply just move value. So that's where solvers come into play, who we really classify as sophisticated actors within the market who have a unique positioning across the board. So in our lens, that could be compliance, that could be market positioning to net flows, that could be back running arbitrage opportunities. The dynamics are really kind of endless. And for us, we just coordinate whether it's a group in Brazil or a group in the Asia region, a group in the US, to be able to have their own trust assumptions, have their own systems, and still be able to talk to one another through solvers. So with that, we also seen obviously in the market a ton of different US stables pop up, as well as the emergence of non-US stables. So in this model, we really look at where is the demand for these stablecoins, both US and non US. And we bring this together to create that unified network of, okay, I want to move money from point A to point B. So here we can really use Tulio. He's our founding designer at Orda. He really just wants a simple expression of I want. He doesn't want to ever worry about the how. So in this, we can draw a lot of parallels to Anoma's architecture, to how Anoma views the future. And this is where we view a lot of synergy and how when we look at our coordination perspective, when we look at Anoma's coordination perspective, together you can essentially get what is this distributed operating system for money. So if we take it a step further and look at, okay, I'm Tulio, I want USDC. How do I actually get USDC? Or how do I actually pay someone in USDC if I'm in Brazil and I have BRL in my local bank account? So to actually get value to be treated as a single value, right, priced one way, we have to create this network that offloads the actual execution paths to these solvers. So for Tulio, he no longer has to worry about, do I want to on-ramp here, swap here, bridge here? Do I want to hold it on this network? Does this person even receive USDC on this network? All that friction gets removed. What Tulio sees is I have Brazilian real and USDC is showing up on the other side. And this now brings us really to what I would call an overview on what we see in the market today and how the industry is approaching solving these issues, right? How do we actually collapse the ladder as an industry? How do we increase that efficiency by removing as many middlemen as possible? What we're starting to see is, of course, Tempo was announced between Stripe and Paradigm yesterday. We have Arc from Circle. We have Stables and Plasma on the Tether realm. And I'm sure we're going to see a ton more. A lot of industry players are attacking it through the value movement supply chain of we should own custody, we should own issuance, compliance, of course, baked in. And they also look at now we need to own settlement. The part that's currently lacking is the liquidity venues, the on-chain primitives to actually facilitate this global value flow. Stable coins have inherently solved a lot of the technical issues in terms of how do we actually remove middlemen, but they haven't solved a lot of the economic design for that. And you'll see here a lot of criticism that I think has gone on like X recently with all these stable chains is there's not going to be one winner. Oh, why would JP Morgan use Stripe Chain? Or why would Circle use Plasma? I think that's the wrong perspective. I think once the dust actually settles, we'll see that it actually makes sense to kind of have your own localized system with your own price discovery, with your own trust assumptions. And we see a future where stablechain A, stablechain B, general purpose blockchain C, you name it, they're all really just going to need to talk to each other at the end of the day. And they're going to want to leverage each other's inventory, execution venues, so on and so forth. So that's really the position in which Orda sits, is how do we help everyone going after issuance and settlement to talk to the other players going after issuance and settlement? How do we help general purpose blockchains play their role in this world? So this kind of brings us to that real big point of stablecoins have solved a lot of the technical issues for value transfer, but not the economic design. Here, we really show our vision for the future, where if you're on a general purpose blockchain, if you're on a stable chain, if you're on a PIX type rail, which is a real-time payment rail over in Brazil, if you're okay with ACH over in the US, that is your trust assumption that you should be okay with. We shouldn't force trust assumptions where they shouldn't be forced. And in a system where you have an abundance of primitives talking to one another, you can't have everything verifiable to a full end-to-end cryptographic type solution. You need to often rely on trust. And what we really see here is it's not about saying we need to just be okay with today's standards of what is acceptable. It's about really mapping out through what we call a cartography of trust in systems, what is interpretable versus what is actually verifiable. And when it comes to Orda, Anoma, or even just your basic system that has to do with storing data, you really want to understand who am I servicing and why. And when you start there and you start to map out the trust, it allows for you to develop primitives that essentially can be interpreted then in other ways, where if you went a path of, let's say, end-to-end verifiability in respect to ZK and compliance, there might be some issues that you run into where, okay, since I have zero knowledge on the actual information associated with the action that occurred, but I know that I can verify the action occurred. If I were to take a simple and maybe extremist example of, if you have a payments company and you need to make sure that Kim Jong-un is not using your service, how do you actually verify not only that Kim Jong-un is not using your service, but then that you can communicate with the relevant bodies in that local authority that it was Kim Jong-un indeed who tried to use it? So that's maybe an extreme example where ZK proofs as an end-to-end solution can actually suffice in that compliant landscape. Another example that we can give is when we look at stablecoins. At the end of the day, if it is fiat redeemable, you really still need to have trust in that government, the fiat that is backing it. And that alone requires trust. And you can really dive down each domain of math, physics, cryptography, biology, economics, markets, sociology, religion, and politics, and you could dive into the geopolitical landscape kind of around the globe. You could dive into a lot of the domestic sort of political landscape and how that influences things. But at the end of the day, what matters is mapping out what is interpretable versus what is verifiable. That is really where I would like to kind of turn it around and say, if there are any questions that anyone has, I want to leave time for that. Okay, I will keep going here because I do have one point that I think is really worth highlighting over here on the problem space. As we see, with this pricing ladder, we can really equate this to blockchain. We can look at how much of what we see in terms of stablecoins and blockchain as a whole is really just an interpretation of legacy models versus what is a redefining primitive? What is a redefining category? And when we look at the market around global money movement, that really is the base for how we actually agree upon whether it's labor, whether it's value, whether it's time and energy. And that's where intents really are something special, I'd say, that you can get very broad in how you interpret what an intent means. And that's what we really are doing here at Orda is we understand it's a price, latency, and access game. In respect to this pricing ladder, when we look at what access means, that refers to a mechanism, really is referring to who sees the liquidity first. What you'll see typically in the Brazilian and like US corridor flow is the interbanks will get access to those spreads. But by the time Tulio, for example, will be able to move his money from the US to Brazil, there's a couple people who are going to touch it, do some opportunities on it, and it really is just this inefficient and outdated system. How we move forward and go around that with solvers is creating the system that allows for competition on these spreads. So, in effort to really collapse this ladder, really understand the price, latency, and access game. And access extends beyond just who sees the liquidity first, but what liquidity is actually available. And with the rise of stable chains, with the rise of new stable coins, with so many different innovations on the way, to constantly stay ahead, one as a developer, and manage all these integrations and have to worry about, do I want to give access to PYUSD now or USDG now or USDB now and every other acronym in the world? It becomes this very overwhelming experience for developers, and it often limits access, right? So by focusing more on how Orda can be leveraged and interpreted by developers as more of a low-level primitive than a plug-and-use solution, we can get very creative on how we actually collapse this ladder. So we'll often see that if you're able to take value over in point A and look at value on point B, where these are two non-interoperable networks, you can actually account for value just being value, right? How do we collapse this value into one? So there's a number of technical primitives, I'd say, being worked on, from resource locks, right, all the way to how do we create specific oracles for FX? How do we create stable clouds? I've started to see. So there's all these different creative ways, and it's about leveraging and interpreting all these different ways, right? So instead of saying, okay, maybe Uniswap's giving the best quote right now, but then Akubo's giving the best quote, or then now Fluid's giving the best quote, you should have access to all of them through one integration. And those execution venues not only should be just a single path of specificity that you can tap into, but they should be loaded to a solver that can then leverage all these different execution venues, inventory venues, and their positioning in the market to actually compete for your order flow. And this is how we essentially redefine how we think about moving money. It's how we collapse that pricing ladder into unified access for one tier. And it's how we effectively achieve interbank spreads for all. I think now we only have think it's 15 more minutes for this, so I will dive a bit more on this. So, when we talk about a cartography of trust in systems, I think that's something that you really need to understand as a developer for the who and the why. When we look at stablecoins as the example, a lot of people really like the access it comes with. They really like the ability to, let's say, spend money or maybe hold US liquidity that they previously couldn't get access to. In the world of money movement, it makes sense to really be okay with letting that type of trust assumption live. But if you look at DeFi, for example, if we're creating, let's say, a new primitive, and that primitive is supposed to be totally cryptographically secured, or let's say economically secured, even, we then also have to understand that within this map of trust, there is a certain point that if, let's say, the US government defaulted, that this system would essentially have a single point of failure. So for us, what it means really to map out this trust, like, how do you look at value? How do you look at what makes up a protocol? How do you look at what makes up a network? At the end of the day, it really all just distills down to it's all just trust assumptions. A real-time payment rail in Brazil, like Pix, really effectively, when you break it down, that low level is no different than an L2 like Arbitrum, which in turn is no different than Solana. They're all just networks. They all just have their own trust assumptions. They all have their own ecosystems. And in these ecosystems, they exist in this map where trust really just compounds. And understanding that and not shying away from it is really how you build these anti-fragile systems and is how you avoid, say, for example, a situation like Luna. I think UST, I think like the whole like Anchor back then, like Luna, it makes sense if everybody was willing to believe in it. And having that trust and not really, I guess, surfacing where that trust actually lies in this map is really where things, in my opinion, went wrong. It's not really about an unsustainable APY, although that compounds and definitely plays into it. It's about the fact that we didn't surface where the trust actually lies, and that creates cracks. And that's really what we mean about what's verifiable versus what's interpretable. And then if it is interpretable, just surface it and better understand it. Um, how this would directly relate to Orda is really quite expansive. It occurs, as I mentioned, on the value side. So maybe Bitcoin is value to you, maybe USDC is value to you, maybe you don't like USDC and you like USDT. At the end of the day, it shouldn't be about forcing these trust assumptions on end users or developers, or even leaving it up to developers to figure this out. So I think that concludes about all I have in this presentation. So happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Hunter. Any questions? Isaac, do you want to try again?
So I'm curious if I'm a user of Orda and I want to specify which things I trust when I issue my transaction. If you have some idea of what that interface should look like.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the market you're building in. Our like go-to-market focus. We're expanding our coverage pretty quickly, but it's centered around US and Latin American flow. So I would say you would definitely want to start with like letting your users decide what is value to them. And by doing that, you likely want to have access to more networks, more assets, more currencies. And then you really want to set them up in a way where you're not forcing them onto a specific network, but you're also not requiring them to know which network they prefer if they don't have a preference. So it really kind of distills down to like the market you're servicing, who they are, and where their trust assumptions lie. And if you're a developer and you're trying to figure this out, it really is as simple as just going and talking to those customers and saying, hey, maybe Bitcoin's of value to you. And then you as a developer now have to go and figure out, how do I also offer access to Bitcoin? But if I'm a remittance app in this example, maybe Bitcoin is just their preference of storing value, but my operations require me to operate in BRL, the local currency in Brazil. So how do you actually create this interface or this experience for that user? Well, Orda will offload really that routing capability to get that best execution possible for you, but we'll also make sure that you have that wide coverage to all these different networks, all these different stores of value.
Thank you very much, Hunter. You've mentioned a couple of different stablecoin chain providers who've already launched or will be launching soon. When you visit their websites, you will encounter a bunch of different use cases, from paying freelancers around the world, sending money between individuals directly, and a bunch more. I would be interested in which of those, or frankly, any use cases you're really seeing, which of these use cases are really materializing right now, and sort of what's your long and short-term prediction for, like, with respect to which of these use cases will have like the most adoption. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the demand's overwhelming is how I'd put it. In the world's really recognizing what technical unlocks stablecoins bring. And I think you really want to start with just looking at the industry as a whole and understanding a lot of the macro first. I think we've seen through the last like 8 years or so a ton of progression and a ton of evolution in not only just understanding what sort of primitives we can build, what sort of infra we can build, but who's using this and why are they using it? And when we look at like the developing and emerging worlds, I would say the fact that you can get access to USDC and use a layer 2 or Solana or whoever and simply just transfer my USDC from one address to another in the cheapest, fastest way possible that I've never seen before, that I was used to sometimes even paying 10, 12% to do that action previously, and it took multiple steps. But now you're saying I can just hold USDC on this blockchain and send it to someone. We started to see an issue as an industry of, well, blockchain is a little bit overwhelming to people who've never seen it before. To even use the word blockchain or cryptography around just your average small medium enterprise, I'd say you kind of lose them. It's not about that, right? So I think stable chains are really trying to position for not only, yes, this overwhelming demand around the developing and emerging markets, but understanding that eventually this will outpace and outgrow any legacy closed system. And I think Tempo did a really good job with their positioning, trying to be as like neutral as possible around stablecoins. How can they be really as neutral as possible in this mission of we need to not just service these developing and emerging markets, but we need to actually compete with legacy finance, for example, from a capacity and capabilities perspective. So that could be anywhere along that price, latency, and access realm. So in a very short answer, like the demand is to just get US stables, and stable chains are capitalizing on that. I think like if we really wanted to dive deep into how the market's playing this, everyone wants to own the value movement supply chain. They want to own that moment that somebody says, I want, so that application layer. And then at the end of the day, they really want to own what I call the edges. And that's that value movement supply chain and then the settlement, which you see on the right side of this slide. So yeah, in short, it's like the demand is for US liquidity in developing emerging markets at the moment. It is shifting. When we look at money movement as a whole, that will really be, from our lens at Orda, a way to collapse the ladder, to open up access to preferable rates, to not have hidden spreads anymore, to compress spreads even down all the way to zero. Because if you really dove deep and wanted to take more of a philosophical type of lens to this, you could really even question why spreads exist in the first place. And they really more so are a result of Band-Aid fixing to a broken system, and a broken system being a legacy pre-funding model that we're unfortunately as an industry replicating on chain today with these stable chains, with these general purpose blockchains. And I think long term the opportunity, and ideally what a lot of these companies think that are doing these stable chains, is if we get issuance and settlement, we can also absorb the middle. So I think the end goal for them is not just, yes, how do we actually go and service the demand we see for global payroll, for US liquidity, so on and so forth, but how do we position for a world that does come on chain, that will be able to quote, for example, an Orda to connect to other issuance and settlement silos.
Last time for Hunter. Thank you. We will take a very short break, and coming up just after the break will be Anthony talking about HyperCow. Don't miss it.